Thank you all for attending today's Employee Auditing and Fraud Prevention webinar. My name is Kristen and I'm with Awareness Technologies, and I'm going to be walking you through our educational webinar today. Our goal today is to spend about 20 to 30 minutes talking at a high level about employee auditing and fraud prevention, give you some insights about what's going on right now in the industry and how we can provide you some options for resolving the issues that you might be seeing. A couple pieces of housekeeping before we get started. Everyone is currently on mute, so if you do have any questions, feel free to type those in the question area of the GoToWebinar. We will provide a copy of this presentation at the end, as well as a recorded version that would be available online. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit of background on myself, just so you kind of know who's talking to you. Like I said, my name is Kristen. I am the Vice President of Business Development here at Awareness Technologies. I've been with the company for about 4 years. Previously, I was at Perimeter eSecurity, which is now Silver Sky. So I've been in the financial technology space for a number of years, and I've kind of seen some of the trends and understand the growing concern about employee fraud. So one of the things that we thought we would do to start off the webinar is talk a little bit about this quote that CUNA's mutual group president, Jeff Prost, said. Thought it was interesting, thought it was a good way to kind of set up what we're talking about here right now. Basically what he's talking about is that in terms of fraud, for credit unions, there's really no immunity for them. It's not a matter of where you're at or how big you are or that you have more senior people or that you have more junior people. It's really something that's going to affect every credit union at one point or the other. And really the key part that he talks about here is lacking the controls to catch the fraud from the very beginning, or getting more relaxed about the controls over time. So really the goal is to understand that you're going to have a fraud incident. It's just going to happen, and we want to be able to catch it early on and hopefully prevent it if we can. So one of the things that we looked at was the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners report. They do this every year. They put out kind of an industry-based report, and they said that last year, banking and financial institutions made up the highest number of cases of fraud, employee fraud. And it kind of steps down from there to government, manufacturing, healthcare, education. And after education, it really drops off to being almost non-existent for other industries. So at 229 cases, banking and financial services has about 60% more fraud cases than the next industry. So it's something that's very, very real, and something that really is focused on our industry. We see it more in financial institutions. The interesting thing about employee fraud, and they're talking about employee dishonesty fraud, and they were saying that was the number one cause, is that it really lasts for about 18 months before it's being detected. And so obviously the longer a case goes on, the more expensive it is. And the longer the case goes on, obviously the more damage they're able to do. So one of the things, again, that we're going to talk about is detecting this before 18 months goes by. So they also say that the median loss is $140,000. Obviously, anytime you're talking about medians, there's going to be things that are higher and things that are lower. About 1/5 of the cases, though, were over $1 million. And something that's interesting, but probably not that unexpected, is that the longer that someone works for an organization, the higher the fraud tends to be. And so obviously that means that your more senior folks have more access to confidential data. They have more access to things that enable them to be able to commit fraud. And when they're doing that, they also tend to have higher fraud because they're able to access the more sensitive data. So it's really not something that's limited to just your junior people or new folks that you have to kind of vet out and figure out. It really is something that affects everybody within the organization. So going back to Jeff's quote, he talked a little bit about how to detect and how to monitor fraud. And he talked about the 3 Ds. And I really liked this idea. And he gave some options for how to implement these 3 Ds that I saw some room for improvement in. So what we're going to do is take his 3 Ds, talk a little bit about what he recommended, what the holes are that we see in that, and then really how to bridge that gap. So deter, detect, and discipline. Those are the 3 Ds that he talks about. For deterring, obviously, like we said, we want to prevent fraud from even happening if we can, and we want to deter it as best as possible. So one of the most common things that is recommended for deterrence is background checks. And background checks are good, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the problems that might come with background checks. He also talks about video surveillance. I think probably everybody has video surveillance within their credit union. And then a fraud policy, something that's in writing that that your employees sign, something they understand from a deterrence standpoint. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges with deterring things. So background checks, like I said, are great, but circumstances change, right? So you could be hired, things could be going well, then your spouse loses their job, or they have medical issues, and all of a sudden now you're in debt, you're going to lose your house, whatever it might be. And now all of a sudden, something that you would maybe not have considered doing before seems like something that you would do. The other thing that's interesting about background checks is it only tells you if someone's been a criminal before or if someone's been caught being a criminal before. It doesn't really address, what's going to happen in the future, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that just because someone had a clear background check means that, they're never had any criminal activity in their background. It just means they were never caught, right? And we know it takes about 18 months for something to get caught, so it's not that unlikely. Video surveillance. Video surveillance is great. Obviously, someone comes in and does something in person, you need to be able to see that. But you're really only seeing part of the story. You're only seeing kind of the physical actions that are taking place within your branch or your location. You're not seeing anything that's happening electronically. You're not seeing probably a lot of stuff that's happening even physically that's just not within the cameras. So probably the only thing that's really deterring is, people stealing pens from the deposit area. That's about it. And then fraud policy. And one of the things that the Association of Certified Fraud Auditors did put in their study is that a lot of people, most people, feel it's hard for you as the business owner to catch fraud. And that was across the industries. It wasn't specific to any industry. And I think that's interesting. So people basically feel like it's kind of a victimless crime. And ultimately, even if you have an audit, even if you have something that comes up and shows you that there's a discrepancy within accounts or whatever it might be, the reality is the employee that's committing the fraud feels like it's hard for you to track it back to them. So even if you have that policy in place, they still kind of feel like they can get around it. So let's talk about detection, which was our second D. So detection, one of the first things that everyone will talk about in terms of detection is access control. So saying who can have access to what and being notified if someone tries to access information they shouldn't be accessing. So you say, your tellers have access to this information, your mortgage group has access to that information, and, they don't have access to each other's information. So you're kind of restricting who can see what. Video surveillance, we already covered that one. Audits, so periodic audits, random audits, annual audits. The whole point of auditing is to detect something that's occurred already. And then finally, monitoring network traffic information along those lines. So what are the challenges with the detection? So access control is great, and access control is absolutely a necessary part of setting up your employees. But the reality is people have to get into the data in order to do their jobs. So your trusted folks that are in the group that have access to the data, you have to let them into that data. And that doesn't guarantee that they won't do anything when they're in there. So if you think about it as a moat around a castle, the moat's great. It's keeping the general population out. But every now and then you have to lower the gate because someone has to come in and, work on the stonework inside the castle. But once he's in there, who knows what it'll do. So it's like a Trojan horse, right? So the point is that you can give people access. You have to give people access. And when they're there, you really need to monitor what they have access to. Again, video surveillance, it only tells part of the story. I think it's really the same challenge that you have with deterring with video. The more interesting one is auditing. So auditing is interesting because it can catch an event. It absolutely can. It can detect. But it can't necessarily detect everything that happened in an event. It doesn't always tell you who did the action, who created the fraud, which again goes back to employees feel like you're not going to be able to know who committed fraud. So it doesn't tell you always the who. A lot of times it doesn't really even tell you the what. It doesn't tell you what exactly happened. A lot of times you just see the endpoint, right? So it's like a glacier. You're seeing 20%, but there's 80% underneath that you don't know what really happened. You see a discrepancy, you see information's been accessed, you know an event occurred. You don't always know necessarily what and how far-reaching it was. When did it take place? Again, if we're talking about a median of 18 months for a fraud event to get caught, when did this start? How long has it been going on? Maybe the employee who even committed that fraud is gone by that point. So when did it take place? Where within your systems? Where physically? What branch? Where did this happen at? What terminal did it happen on? What computer did it happen on? And then how? And how is really one of the hardest ones, which is how did somebody do this? How did it not get caught? How did it get around the systems that you've put in place? How did it happen? Monitoring. So everybody pretty much has network monitoring. I'd be shocked if anyone told me they don't run a firewall or IDS, IPS, something along those lines. And again, my background is coming from that industry, so I certainly understand the value of it. But the world's kind of changed since traditional network monitoring has been put into place. People have remote users now, and a lot of times network monitoring is not capturing what people do remotely. It's not necessarily capturing when your staff takes their laptops or their smartphones off network and have access to all the confidential data still from there. It's not always seeing things like webmail or Dropbox or any of those online Google Docs, anywhere where you can upload documentation and access it from anywhere at any time. Can your people connect to other internet sources? Do they have laptops that are Wi-Fi enabled? Are you next to a Starbucks or a Panera? Can they hop on your Wi-Fi? If they can jump to another Wi-Fi source, they are circumventing all of your network security. It's done. They've no longer gone through your firewall. They haven't gone through your IDS, your IPS. They are out there on their own now with still all the information that resides within that computer that they're accessing it on. Can they work offline? Can they disconnect their computer? Can they type things up on an Excel spreadsheet? Can they copy things to a USB? Can they print anything? All those things are things that network monitoring is not seeing. So it's really tough to anticipate every circumstance and make everybody go through network monitoring for it to work. Really, it's kind of there's a hole right now from network security that really is kind of hard to anticipate every option that someone can do. So finally, our last D is discipline. And really the conversation for discipline is knowing that an action is going to take place if you commit fraud. So knowing that you're going to be terminated, knowing it's going to go on your record within the company, knowing that depending on the level of severity of an incident, there will be a process that gets put in place for that. The really hard thing with discipline, ultimately, is that it's hard to catch the event to discipline it. And that's kind of the weakness there. So how do you close the gaps? How do you answer the things that I've pointed out are the problems? And I like this little image because it's kind of like the V8 person, you know, when they smack their head and they said they should have had a V8 to get all their vegetables and fruit in. And really, I think a lot of these things are kind of common sense. But I think everyone, you know, they're so busy trying to implement so many things, they don't always think about these things first. So first off, if we go back to deterrence, one of the biggest ways to deter fraud is to let people know they're being monitored. It's just that simple. And I still work with a lot of financial institutions that say to me, they don't want their employees to know they're being monitored. They don't want to feel big brothery. They don't want to, you know, whatever it might be. And I've never fully understood why you wouldn't want to let people know they're being monitored, because just like with anything else, if people feel like they're being watched, just like those video surveillance cameras, they're less likely to steal something. So if you know a camera is pointed on you, you're less likely to take $10 out of a till and put it into your pocket. If you know that something is monitoring your computer, you're less likely to commit an act of fraud on your computer. So really making monitoring public knowledge is a huge part of the deterrence. And again, putting something like video surveillance on the computer so that someone knows, just like how you could see if I go into the vault and I start accessing things I shouldn't access, if I access things I shouldn't access on my computer, you will also be notified of that. Detecting. So if we go back to access control, you want to give access control. You want to let people go in and do their job, but you have to monitor what they do when they get there. So just blocking someone from getting to information isn't enough. You have to know that when they go in and get the information they need, because they have to do their job, are they using that information correctly? Are they accessing it correctly? Or are they doing something malicious? And really making sure that you have proactive notifications to catch events early. So what we want to do is we want to limit that 18-month span. We want to say we understand that a fraud event is probably going to happen, but the difference between us catching it, hours, days into the event versus 18 months into the event is the difference between, very little damage and $1 million+ of damage. So being notified when anomalous behavior starts happening, being notified immediately when someone starts accessing something that they don't need to be accessing to do their job, or even accessing high volumes of things. Maybe you are supposed to have access into that database, but all of a sudden now you start printing out information and you start copying information, and that's something you've never done before. There's probably something going on, so we want to be notified of that. Maybe you were asked to do that because you had an exam coming up, and then we can cross-reference that notification. We can put a note of it that it seemed like the behavior was in line with what you've been asked to do, but we have an audit record then. And finally, discipline. So having an audit trail in the event of an event, which basically means if you have something that looks like fraud, can you show all the actions leading up to and after the event? Can you say whether it was a malicious event or whether it was something that looked accidental? Did somebody access something that would look like fraud, but in reality they just had gone to the wrong place? And I think everyone has moments where they've attached the wrong email to an email, wrong attachment to an email, have had moments where they've, sent an email to the wrong recipient, and that can be a data breach, and it can be a big deal, and it can be something that costs an organization money, and it's important to know if somebody did it on purpose or not. And then you also have HR coverage, so you can say, when you go to terminate somebody, you can say, here's the play-by-play of what you did. Here's where you did this action. Here's how we know it was malicious, and then being able to terminate somebody on top of that. So it really takes care of that other part that Jeff had mentioned, which was making sure that people understand that there'll be consequences to their actions, that if you're caught, there's an HR consequence for that action. And then I guess maybe that'll show up on their background check next time for somebody else. So that's kind of how we look at plugging up those holes. So just really quickly, I want to talk to you very briefly about who Awareness Technologies is, just so you kind of have some context about who we are and why we're talking about this. We were founded in 2002 and primarily founded to be kind of a tool that was used for investigations, national security kind of work. It's spread then into the business side and private use, and has really become something that's been used for not only productivity improvement, but also employee auditing and employee fraud prevention. And we have customers all over the world that are using this, and we've been growing pretty rapidly. We are used by government still. We're also used by financial institutions, healthcare, anybody who's really concerned about fraud. The interesting thing about fraud is that it can really be a number of different things. So Continental Airlines is on here, and they're a good example of someone who uses this kind of differently. They load it up on computers, put them in baggage claim, and then wait to see if baggage handlers are stealing stuff out of bags. So they can know then if that computer gets turned on and what's happening. So kind of a different fraud than I think probably most financial institutions would be using it for. Certainly a different use than like a Union Bank or a Royal Business Bank that we have listed here would be using it in. But still kind of covering that gamut of employee fraud and really looking at it from the endpoint as to what's happening, because that's where the confidential data is going to be at. That's where the actions are taking place. They're not taking place on a server somewhere far, far away. They're taking place on the computer that employee has access to. So that's really where we come in. We have an agent that goes onto the computer. It does employee monitoring and auditing. It does notifications. It does laptop recovery if that computer is lost or stolen. So again, something that could look like fraud, but maybe would be accidental. and data loss prevention to stop that information from going out. And it's really quick and easy for you to try. It's on the endpoint, which is where, again, those trusted users are at because they are the employees, and that's where they're accessing the data at. So everything can be installed on your desktops, your laptops, your mobile devices from a BYOD standpoint, and allow you to be able to monitor that activity regardless of where they're at, and to be able to proactively be notified and have an audit trail if you do go through an exam or something, or have a fraud incident, so that you can show the who, what, when, where, and why of an event. So really, if you think about it from how it fits in and from an internal threat continuum, I think a lot of people kind of do monitoring from a productivity standpoint. They're worried about where people surf. We also are looking at the programs people are using, not just the web surfing, which has a productivity component of it, but also kind of stretches into that data loss prevention, that fraud prevention, knowing what's taking place, email, IM, programs, taking screenshots of all the activity that's taking place on the computer so you could play it back and have that video surveillance on your computer, basically. And really be able to block activity. One of the interesting things here is that a lot of organizations I work with, they do USB blocking, and it's black or white, right? It's either all on or all off. The thing that's important to remember is that people need to be able to use USBs a lot of times to get their jobs done. And so again, you can't go all one way or all the other. So with this, it allows you to kind of be a little smart about what can and can't go onto a USB and what can and can't be accessed. It doesn't have to be black and white. So again, letting that bridge come down over the moat so that people can get it, but still knowing what they're doing when they're in there. And then finally, that laptop recovery. So I don't want to spend too much time walking through our product. I wanted to keep this educational, high level. But we do have a product demo going on Thursday. If you'd like to register for that, that would be more in depth about how our solution works and allowing you to see how that could help you monitor and block from there. We also do have a free trial if you wanted to install it, test it, play around with it yourself. Or, you could feel free to give us a call, send us an email. We're happy to talk through any of this with you. And here's my contact information as well. So what we're going to do now is just kind of leave the session up for a couple of minutes, go through any questions that might have presented themselves. Just type them in that questions area for me, and I'll be happy to answer those now for you. Anything really that kind of spans financial, technology, from a technology standpoint, preventing fraud, fraud thoughts in general, employee fraud, employee activity, whatever it might be. So we'll take a second here, let everyone finish typing up their questions, and then we'll start going through those and answering them. And I do know a number of people are asking, I've already seen a couple ones come in, if the slide deck would be available. Yep, I will send out the slide deck to you as well, and there will be a recorded version that we'll send you access to as well if you wanted to show this to anybody else within your organization or kind of think over some of the things we've been talking about here. So any questions?